Hello, my name is James Duminy, and I'm a human geographer based at the University of Bristol in the School of Geographical Sciences, and I'm an honorary research associate at the African Centre for Cities. My work mainly concentrates on the governance of urban change in the Global South, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of food governance and planning in African cities. The basic argument that I want to make today is that in order to understand the present situation of food governance and planning in African cities, we actually need to go all the way back to colonial times and to understand colonial histories of urban food governance. The structure of this presentation is based around two key moments in the emergence of urban food systems as matters of governmental planning concern. The first was how food was caught up in official concerns around public health in emerging and rapidly growing colonial towns. The second moment was how officials and politicians became increasingly concerned with food supply, with food prices, and with the nutrition of urban workers, particularly around the time of the Second World War. I'm mainly going to talk about Kenya today, and I do acknowledge that this was a very specific kind of context. You might well have seen different dynamics in West Africa, for example, where there was a longer history of pre-colonial urban settlements. In North Africa, where you had a very long history of cities such as Alexandria, and potentially different dynamics in Francophone or Lusophone colonial contexts. But I do believe that by looking at Kenya, which represented many of the kinds of concerns and anxieties of colonial officials more generally on the continent, we can learn a great deal about more general kinds of problems and practices of urban food governance in Africa. Now, at the start of the 20th century, for the most part, there weren't very many recognizably urban settlements, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there were the exceptions of South Africa, where you had older colonial towns like Cape Town, the exceptions of West African cities like Kumasi and Ibadan and Lagos, and of course, North African cities like Alexandria. In Kenya, there were very small settlements at the start of the 20th century, which were mainly serving as administrative centers for colonial officials or as military establishments. So, for example, Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, originally started as the headquarters for the construction of the railway from coastal Mombasa to the inland regions of Lake Victoria. These urban settlements were generally small, they were largely unserviced, and they lacked what we would understand as local governance institutions. They weren't departments of health, for example, or departments of labor at that stage. They were mainly home to European settlers or colonial officials. And food wasn't really something that was considered an object or an issue of major official concern. Food was simply something to be procured from surrounding traders or local farmers. So there was nothing that we would call the governance or planning of food in these places, in these small emerging urban settlements. In fact, the major problem facing colonial officials at that stage was really the issue of hunger and famine that affected mainly rural populations in Kenya. However, as these small administrative or military settlements grew into towns through the influx of migrants, including white settlers, including Asian traders and workers and artisans, and including African workers, you saw institutions of local governance emerge. These included departments of health and labor, for example, and you started to see food become an issue for concerted political debate and for something that required official action and governance. It's quite well known that the origins of urban planning as a profession, as a discipline, as a set of practices actually arises in the history of public health as a particular kind of concern. And here we can look to experiences in Europe and North America where municipal officials increasingly worried about public health issues that were arising in these industrial cities of the global north. So concerns, for example, around the spread of cholera or infectious disease. In the later decades of the 19th century, public officials in European and North American cities increasingly became concerned with health problems affecting their urban populations, the populations of people living in industrial cities of Europe and North America. And they started to create institutions, municipal institutions, that could control urban land use that could build sufficient infrastructures to deliver clean water and sanitation services to their urban populations. Now, with a colonial expansion in regions such as Africa, many of those concerns and practices surrounding public health were exported to colonial contexts, such as Kenya. If we're to understand the early governance of food systems in colonial African cities, we need to understand that food was seen as one aspect of these wider concerns and anxieties surrounding public health specifically. So, for example, in South Africa, the 1919 Public Health Act specifically worried about regulating the supply of meat and milk and other foodstuffs to South Africa's growing colonial towns. In Kenya, the 1921 Public Health Act very closely mirrored those sorts of concerns and practices. At this stage, Kenyan officials were clearly worried about food becoming contaminated and potentially spreading infectious disease. So this 1921 Public Health Ordinance gave officials the power to regulate things like the inspection and disposal of food that was being imported or exported from Kenya, the powers to regulate animal products, where they were prepared, how they were stored, the powers to regulate the quality and the labeling of food receptacles, the powers to regulate the standards of foodstuffs that were being offered for sale and consumption, the powers to regulate the inspection of animals, places where animal products were going to... complete. In order to understand how food actually emerged initially as something of interest for colonial urban officials, we need to understand that originally food featured as a concern, specifically as being one aspect of these wider concerns and anxieties surrounding public health in colonial towns. In South Africa, for example, the 1919 Public Health Act was specifically worried about regulating the supply of meat and milk and other foodstuffs to the colony's growing towns. In Kenya, 2 years later, in 1921, the Public Health Ordinance closely followed those sorts of practices that were originally developed in South Africa. The ordinance essentially gave officials the power to try and prevent the contamination of foodstuffs and hence the spread of infectious disease. The 1921 ordinance gave officials the power to regulate, to inspect, and dispose of food that was being imported to or exported from the colony, the power to regulate the construction or the occupation and the use of buildings in which food was being prepared or stored, the power to regulate the standards of foodstuffs that were being offered for consumption and trade, the power to regulate the inspection of animals and places in which animal products were being prepared and stored, and the power to regulate the quality and labeling of food receptacles, as well as to regulate the establishment and the use of marketplaces in colonial towns. So in short, early practices of food governance or food planning in colonial towns focused mainly on regulating the built environment in order to prevent the contamination of foodstuffs and hence the spread of infectious diseases. However, by the late 1920s, a second kind of interest in food planning and governance had started to emerge amongst colonial officials in a place like Kenya. And this was an interest that was specifically had more to do with the diet and the nutrition of workers in colonial towns. Officials and employers began to worry increasingly about the standard of living of their workers in colonial towns and about the standard of what people were eating as being potentially undermining the productivity of their labor force and hence the productivity of colonial enterprises more generally. So for them, for these employers and officials, the problem was less about the built environment and how food was moved through and stored within the built environment, and it was more to do with the incomes that workers were earning, hence what sort of income they had to spend on foodstuffs, what they could afford to eat, and also what urban workers were being given, the quality of the foodstuffs that they were being given by their employers as what were known as rations. There was actually very little that Kenyan officials at this stage could do, though, to regulate these sorts of issues. They didn't necessarily have the power to control the price of foodstuffs or to control directly what employers were giving their workers as rations. However, the opportunity to do so did arise with the Second World War, where the necessity of passing military regulations and tightly controlling food systems meant that officials were able to establish centralized boards that had the powers to regulate, to fix the prices that farmers and producers were paid for their goods, but also to regulate and fix the prices of consumer prices. They also, with the advent of a strict rationing scheme, were able to very closely monitor what people were being given to eat in terms of the foodstuff's actual nutritional content. In short, then, on top of this growing interest in the built environment and regulating the built environment as a means to prevent the spread of infectious disease, by the end of the Second World War, 1945, there was also another and far more economic interest and concern with the way in which food was being planned in the colony's growing towns. And that was a mode based on thinking about food prices, about incomes, and about exactly what people were eating. However, it is worth noting that actually local officials, municipal officials, had very little powers to regulate aspects of the food system as a whole. With the advent of these military regulations and the centralization of control over food systems that arose at the time of the Second World War, food was seen as something of national importance, and hence it required central government institutions and central government control in order to ensure the equitable distribution of foodstuffs amongst the territory's entire population. So while local officials could do things like regulate marketplaces and confiscate food because they deemed it unwholesome or potentially a source of infectious disease, actually it was only the central government that had the powers to regulate things like incomes and prices and so on. So it's against this backdrop, this kind of dual mode of urban food governance, that contemporary urban food planning and governance in African cities emerges. On one hand, you have local officials, city officials, that are able to regulate aspects of the built environment and how the built environment is used in order to prevent public health issues. And on the other hand, you have issues around food supply and pricing and nutrition as being increasingly seen as the domain of central government. And within that disjuncture, you have a situation where, despite the fact that urban officials might be very attuned and aware of urban food governance challenges and the need to intervene in the urban food systems, that traditionally has been and remains the domain of central government and central officials. So I hope that helps to explain a little bit about why we see urban food governance existing in the way that it does in many African cities. And also, I hope that it helps to remember that the present, in order to understand the present and the future, we should have a healthy understanding of the past. Thank you.